Welcome to Let's Talk Value Chain, a podcast where we explore the different activities, trends, topics, and components within value chains from manufacturing to impacts on supply chains to AI to blockchains.
Welcome to the first episode of Let's Talk Value Chain. In our first episode, we are talking to Professor Jay Bal, previously from Warwick Manufacturing Group, and currently supporting Nottingham Trent University. Jay is also known for his project, West Midlands Centre Marketplace, which at its peak was supporting the generation of 1 billion in tenure revenues for its customers across the manufacturing sector in UK. In the first episode, we discussed with Jay how generative AI can potentially have an impact on the different aspects of supply chain with regards skills, the opportunity for innovation. Let's dive into this interesting conversation and gain some insights. Welcome, Jay, to the first episode of Let's Talk Value Chains. So before we get into this our conversation today, do you want to give us a little bit of introduction of who you are and why you be interested in the areas of value chains and supply chains?
Supply chains, particularly, I think it goes back to the broad experience that I've had over my career. So I started off really as a electronics design engineer, but then moved into factory management and ran a factory for GEC, making telephone exchanges for a while. And then I moved on into chip design, but eventually ended up at the University of Warwick. And this is all really as part of my main goal in life, which is to make where I live, my town, my region, my country, wealthier and better. I think growing up in the kind of 70s and 80s when we had depression, had like a strong desire to try and make the region wealthier and happier. And being based in the Midlands, the motor industry has always been in decline for a long, long time. And one of my kind of main interests was how can we kind of transfer a lot of the businesses I was going to meet, a lot of SMEs that are in the automotive sector. How can I help them move out of automotive as the automotive industry declined? So that's really got my interest into supply chains. But initially, it wasn't in the kind of operation of supply chains. It was in how can we form new supply chains? How can we help these SMEs get into new markets and into new supply chains rather than the automotive one? So that was kind of what drove my initial interest, how to make my region more successful. And that needed to be well connected into supply chains.
And that's amazing, Jay. I think, you and I have talked about this quite a lot as well. And a lot of that passion has rubbed off with me and why now I am doing supply chain full time. But I think, now that you've had this wealth of experience and a huge number of projects that you've worked on, and in the impact that you've already created, you've moved to the next phase of your life, which I like to call semi-retirement, right? Because you're still doing a lot of interesting stuff, and especially around your topic of interest in supply chain and using generative AI. Firstly, what's made you move in that direction, and what are you up to with that?
Well, okay, just really following on with this, trying to help companies move out of declining markets. So we applied for and got funding of around 3 million plus from European regional funding. We built a marketplace that was a competence-based marketplace, so that where we captured not what companies do at the moment, but what they can do. And we built probably the world's first competence-based marketplace for engineering SMEs or manufacturing SMEs in the region. And eventually we had over 14,000 companies using that marketplace, getting together to bid for orders or tenders. And at one time, back in about 2012 to 14, the member companies were winning around £4 billion worth of business. And it was quite a significant impact. But the main difficulty we always had was how do we make it sustainable? How do we kind of generate revenue from it? And we never really solved that problem. So when AI came along, it allowed me to think about how we can solve that problem in a more cost-effective manner, really. And that's really what started my interest again in generative AI. But I used to teach AI 20 years ago at the University of Warwick. So it was one of the first courses, and we used to look at search algorithms, which was my main expertise, but also natural language processing, neural networks. And I built quite a number of expert systems to help, at that time, Jaguar Land Rover. In fact, my PhD was on building expert systems for material selection. And so that's what sort of got me in that area and stayed in that area. But to be honest, the area went dead, to about 2012 onwards. There was nothing much happening because the problem was that we could build expert systems. And an example was like a system to detect bacteriological infections. But these systems had no general knowledge. So, for example, if you gave it data from like a pregnant lady, it would try and infer that there were some bacteriological infections, not that the lady was pregnant. So this whole general knowledge was one of the main things that held back the development of kind of expert systems. But, we could build good systems even at that time, but we couldn't build this general knowledge. And when generative AI came along, that was, for me, a solution. And it was the solution the sector was looking for to help them with this general knowledge. So it's really helped address one of the main problems that we saw in applying expert systems, if you want to call them that, into everyday life.
And what are the main challenges you feel and opportunities now the generative AI has in transforming the supply chain industry specifically? Because a lot of companies, especially supply chain being a core domain, while everybody's hearing AI and they know about OpenAI and ChatGPT, everybody's concerned in terms of, how will that add value to me and my supply chain, what I do on a day-to-day basis?
That's a question that a lot of people are thinking about at the moment. I mean, there's huge applications of many other fields of AI in, even, for example, I talked about search algorithms, and a lot of companies use those to optimize delivery schedules, etc. Parcels companies have built worldwide tracking systems, forecasting systems. American Airlines Cargo build a user system to forecast shortages and stockouts. So AI is being used for a long time, and especially with larger companies. But the big issue was, what can generative AI do and where are its best applications? And I think that generative AI really has a big application for SMEs in particular, because it allows them to bring a high level of general knowledge to support their existing staff. So we're doing a project with an SME. They design here in the UK, they source in China, and they obviously have to sort of bring the goods over through customs inspections, usually in Southampton, and then via their own warehouses to Amazon warehouses. And managing and controlling that takes up a lot of time and effort for them. And we've got a whole bunch of instances where simple mistakes end up costing them a lot and locking away products for periods of time where they can't use them. For example, one time they put on the wrong price by over 100% on their product on the Amazon listing. And obviously that product didn't sell because it was 100% more expensive than its competitor. But that stock had to be held. It's how do you manage that? And one of the ways we're doing that is using generative AI to create assistants for each of the 6 employees that carry out specific tasks. Tasks such as managing the operations in China, managing the customs inspections and the stockages in their own warehouses, and then managing the transfer and management of stock at the Amazon warehouses using the vast amount of information that they can get from Amazon about the status of their products. So they've got 6 employees who work really hard in trying to smooth operations. But they don't. They make mistakes, crises occur, customs hold up whole shipments for reasons they can't understand. It's hard to communicate with them. So all of these issues mean that the overall supply chain is quite inefficient. So what we're doing is creating assistants for each of the employees who kind of manage various stages of that supply chain. And we are then also building a real-time, as much as we can, a monitor of the overall supply chain. Now, bringing this down to SME level is kind of quite new. People have talked about this for a long time, but I haven't seen it in many SMEs. This additional intelligence and support, the reduction of errors by staff within the SME. So currently we're building assistants for each of the 6 staff to help them improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the tasks they do. I reduce errors, make better decisions, and spend more time on the difficult problems and less time on the routine and fairly logical kind of operations.
I think that's very interesting there, because I think that's where I see generative AI supporting. A lot of people are afraid of it taking away jobs and creating negative impact. But in reality, what it's doing, it's creating an assistive technology to be able to get 6 people do what you would require 12 people to do inefficient. I think that's, again, use cases, as you're mentioning, are critical to be able to validate that and show the success stories with that. Now, and as we talked about the supply chain and the people and assistive technologies, I think one of the core questions I have is, with this new era of emerging technologies, including generative AI, blockchain coming in core domains of supply chain, how do you see the skills required for the job role changing for students who are in universities right now studying supply chain, or even experts who've been in the industry, but the industry is changing so drastically now?
I think, especially if you carry on sort of talking more about small and medium-sized businesses, then what they often lack is the breadth of skills and capability. So I think that it's important nowadays to understand not only kind of technology, but also kind of operations and the more practical side of business. And that is quite a rare combination. So, during my career, we've employed software engineers lots of times to try and help us build systems to solve problems. But the task of getting them to understand what we need for the actual factory or for the business is really, really difficult. And I think that learning how to use generative AI to help develop systems for yourself, maybe with support from more specialist software engineers, I think that's a big opportunity. But the kind of skills you need really are the ability to do quantitative analysis, e-commerce skills, understanding IT systems, an increasing need for cybersecurity as your company gets more and more dependent on these systems and generative AI, then these are kind of useful skills. But the brilliant thing is that all of this can be learnt using generative AI. So it's kind of, bootstrapping yourself up. And at the moment, universities are not really teaching very well how to use these tools to actually improve your own knowledge and expertise. But already we're beginning to get, people finding that they're better for learning foreign languages, for example. So I think most people still see them as very specific tools, whereas they're very general purpose tools. So they can be used for a lot of things. And I think students and people who want to be outstanding in their jobs need to learn how to use these generative AI tools like GPT, like Perplexity, like Claude 2. They need to learn how to use them well. I think it's like the modern equivalent of learning how to Google properly. Many people think they can Google, but not very well generally. And it's the same. Many people think that you can just put in requests or questions into generative AI and get good answers. I think a real key skill to develop for existing staff in companies and for students is how to use these tools well to get better answers.
Yeah, I think agreed. Prompt engineering is becoming, just as SEO was for your websites. I think prompt engineering is becoming a key skill set for you to be able to get the right answers. But I personally also see a lot of opportunity being created by reducing the baseline knowledge required for SMEs or individuals to be able to run complex supply chains in the area that if you have the right assistive technologies, you're able to empower graduates and more quickly with more real-time data and information to be able to use to analyze and give the guardrails to teach them and get up to speed, rather than what we have traditionally seen with SMEs and manufacturers, that your supply chain and procurement people are people in your team who've been there for 10, 20 years. And that's when they really know. But then, one, it's a difficult resource to get and build today, and then be able to scale that due to the complexities the world is throwing at us. Which brings on me to my next question. So, we've got this issue with the Red Sea blockage and, shipments being delayed. We heard about, IKEA having to figure out their production, Tesla having to stop their own production today. What are your thoughts on some of the areas where generative AI or similar technologies could offer some sort of prevention or some sort of corrective actions now to be able to support or reduce the disruptions?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are many examples already of companies using AI, particularly machine learning or search algorithms, etc., to improve supply chains. I mean, a classic example of use of machine learning was Pfizer and BioNTech using it to help with the distribution of COVID vaccine, where, it had to be transported at minus 75 degrees C. You had to make sure that it was always under those conditions and things. So they use machine learning. But the application of generative AI is a bit more interesting and not so obvious, I think. One of the areas I see that it could have a big impact is really looking at early signals from a number of different data sources and then suggesting solutions. So, for example, imagine there's a epidemic of potato blight happening in some South American country, and we need to send the appropriate herbicides over to that place from our warehouse in, let's say, in the USA. How do we anticipate that and start doing that? Well, one way of anticipating is looking at Google searches. And we can start searching for when looking for when people start doing particular types of searches, i.e. for potato damage, etc. And that can help us align our supply chains from these very early signals. And I think generative AI is going to be the tool that's going to connect together these different signals and give you very early signals about how you need to start adapting your supply chain and modifying operations to address where the demand is highest. Now, some of that is already kind of being done with like ships avoiding the Red Sea and changing destinations depending on demand in particular locations in Europe. I mean, some of that's going on, but with generative AI, we can look at more signals that can help us make those decisions. So, obviously Google searches for particular things are an obvious example. It was interesting that, part of the investigation into COVID looked at searches for cough medicine and coughing, etc., around in Wuhan to try and identify where the initial location might have been. And in the same way, there are a lot of signals coming from different sources which can help us identify blockages, opportunities, and allow us to reconfigure supply chains to address those in a more timely and efficient manner. So I think that's where I see generative AI, bringing in signals or inferring signals from a lot of different sources and being able to come to conclusions about what might be the best supply chain response to those, as well as, just making better decisions around operations along the example I described earlier on.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And, that's what we see with some of our customers as well. Understanding your supply chain, your risks within your supply chain, because sometimes it might be the smallest components that you don't even know about that are critically dependent on these issues. And being able to know how you manage that and how resilient your supply chain is going to be should be what you've learned over the last 4 years. Is a practice ongoing, right? I mean, there's been so many different world events causing supply chain disruptions every time. You would expect that people and companies are starting to get better prepared for this now.
I think another interesting perspective on this, Nishant, is to some extent taking people out of the equation. For example, if you look at the Red Sea effect, now we're getting kind of part of the disruption is being caused by people who got a particular view on the situation. Now, when we've done simulations of supply chains, in fact, we used kind of the Hewlett-Packard printer supply chain as our kind of base supply chain example. And we did simulations with human decision making at each of the sort of key stages in the supply chain. Yeah. And what we found was that human behavior and preferences affected the performance of the supply chain. For example, in one simulation, everybody started compensating for one particular actor in the supply chain making decisions because to them, his decisions were not rational and maybe not quick enough. And this leads to a situation where, and it's driven by a situation where people are optimizing each stage of the supply chain rather than the overall supply chain. I mean, when you're a SME within a supply chain, you're under pressure to kind of produce the requirements, but you're also trying to optimize yourself because everybody's trying to optimize themselves quite often at a loss to you. So I think there's an interesting viewpoint maybe that kind of generative AI driven decision making may be less biased than people may be, and we may get smoother supply chain operations as a result. So I'm really interested in testing this when we built these agents to assist these people in the SME that I described earlier on. I think it's not really been questioned and it's not really been researched that much, but the effect of kind of human behavior in decision making in supply chains, nearly all research has been done on computer simulations of behavior, but it doesn't capture human behavior. And I think that also will help us better address some of the disruption problems that we have.
So lastly, Jay, what would be your advice to, again, anybody now looking to either upskill themselves in this area or looking at specific technologies that they should focus on? Where should they start today if they want to understand generative AI, supply chains, or just be better at what they're doing in this space?
Well, I think the first most thing is to keep your eyes on the ball and to stay up to date in the field. So collaboration is really key to that. So go and join groups and platforms, like the appropriate groups on LinkedIn, Facebook, the trade bodies, to stay up to date with what is the conversation in your industry. What are people trying to do? What success are they having or what failures are they learning from? So I think one is to stay up to date with the conversation. We're lucky nowadays because we have a lot of online groups and platforms to follow and be involved in the conversation. So I always tell my students, go and join the appropriate groups on LinkedIn and Facebook or the appropriate trade bodies. I think the other thing, which I kind of hinted at earlier on, is online learning is really very effective. And I mean, whenever I'm doing any DIY at home, the first thing I go and do is look for the YouTube videos on it. And so the tools available for self-learning are really, good nowadays, and we can use them to sort of keep up to date with what's happened. And particularly, as I mentioned earlier on, generative AI is really great for learning. So the fact is, what you need to do, it's not like Google. You don't put in a question and get an answer. What you have to do is to have a conversation with it. And conversations are what help you learn. They kind of drive your development of your knowledge through discussions. And generative AI can help you have good discussions if you have discussions with it. I think a lot of people are still using it in a kind of search engine method where they ask it questions and look at the answers. But it goes back to what you talked about earlier on, prompting. Prompting is about having conversations where you push the AI into the areas that you want to develop further, not let it control where you go.
Now, I think that's amazing advice, Jay. So, just before we end, is there any last thoughts you want to share with the listeners?
I think we're really coming for a huge revolution in supply chains. I think that the platforms that we have available nowadays and the access to them through APIs will give us much better insights into what's happening with supply chains, and tools like generative AI will help us understand, and machine learning will help us understand how they're behaving. So we're getting into a world where there's much more disruption and many more events that mess up and destroy our best laid plans. But I think also we're getting tools to help us adapt and change very quickly. And how the tools that we develop or the tools that we use in our everyday life that give us early signals of impending disruptions, let's call them, not just for supply chains, but for our lives as well. I think they're getting better and better. And one of the key requirements is to really stay up to date. And I think generative AI and AI developments in particular are going to really help us stay up to date. Everybody worries about being replaced by AI. I worry more about how can I use it to help me do what I'm doing better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it's a generally transformative time. And again, what at least ChatGPT and OpenAI have done is shown the mass scale adoption of the technology. And again, the general knowledge aspect of it, right? I think the specifics with expert systems were there previously, but that general knowledge is going to amplify the reach. And again, I think as we discussed, it's about assisting rather than, replacing, because that's where the real value still lies. So Jay, thanks for being on our show. And we look to catch up with you again on a later date. Thank you for listening to our first episode. Hope you found it useful and insightful. If you want to reach out to me or Jay, ping us a message on LinkedIn. This episode was sponsored by Value Chain, which is a leading software provider for supply chain management optimization powered with data and AI across sectors of manufacturing, technology, construction, and more.